Hello everyone, this is a Free Russia Forum channel, and we begin this stream that I announced yesterday. Today, with us, after a long break, we have the 13th chess champion, a co-founder of the Free Russia Forum, Garry Kasparov. Hello, Garry. Hello. And I would like to start with today's news that seem to be kind of appropriate for our stream, if I may say so, appropriate, kind of negatively appropriate. As I understand, the Attorney General Office began an investigation of your activities on suspicion of high treason. And the initiator of this investigation is a professional snitch, Vitaly Borodin, who, by the way, is included in our Putin's list, and he managed to show himself in some quite unpleasant cases. He slanders Russian oppositionists and civil society, then he reports to the Putin's system of repression. Those reports are used in the Putin's system, and from his Telegram channel we found out that they launched this investigation. Before that, you, Garry, were called an extremist, a terrorist, and now you're blamed of high treason. So how do you feel? Let's call it our Borodin's Day. Frankly, there is nothing surprising in this. In my English Twitter, people started asking, so why the authorities waited for so long? We need to understand there is a certain progression. The situation is toughening, and clearly they will provide the most absurd accusations. And frankly, I don't understand terrorist, extremist or high treason, whatever. So I don't recognize this authority, I don't recognize this power. This is a gang of thugs who took over the power in my country, and if they think that I betrayed them, so yes, I did, and I think that betraying dictatorship is a proper way to do it. We need to look at it from a different angle. Those thugs who took over the power in our country, that's why they blame us of any sins, of terrorism, corruption, and many more. Actually, all these things that they committed. That's why I think it's a natural process. Some of us will be blamed of high treason sooner or later. Some of our colleagues are in prison and sentenced. But as far as I know, they did not apply high treason yet. I think in Vladimir Karamazov's case, they used it though. So, but I have to say, they're moving in one direction, so the regime is under siege, and all of us are enemies, and understandably we should react to it with calm. So the regime is illegitimate, the war is criminal, and Crimea belongs to Ukraine, and this illegitimate regime could do whatever. And today, when I learned about this news, I wrote in my Telegram channel, I said that Garry Kasparov did not swear allegiance to this criminal regime. So we did not swear allegiance to this regime, and you're right, they are all criminals. And let me tell you, formally, according to their laws, they are double criminals, because first they broke their allegiance to the Soviet Union as KGB officers, as we remember, and then they broke their allegiance to the Russian Federation to protect its constitution, and many more. So it wouldn't be bad to put them through their own justice system grinder using this criminal case and the crime they committed. And I think it would be very easy to prove it. But hell with them. So this is what I don't understand. What's going on in the United States of America? We had so many hopes for it, all of us, and particularly the Ukrainians. And this issue of military assistance to Ukraine is kind of hanging in the air. And frankly, I kind of lost track of all these events and what's going on. Could you tell us a little bit what's going on with this notorious military assistance to Ukraine draft. Well, in fact, the situation is not that hopeless, and it's not an issue of the faraway future. I think in some form this military assistance to Ukraine law and just in general all international affairs became hostages of the American policy. And I don't want to go into details, but I have to say that American policy or politics became very small. Alas, everybody feels that, and many people in the United States, responsible people, they understand their role and the role of the United States in the international affairs, and they do everything they can so that this, at least this law is passed. I have a hunch that this law will be passed, despite the resistance of some of the Republicans, and clearly there is a backstage games of Trump, who is not hiding his geopolitical preferences anymore. The pressure on the side of those who are trying to push this law will become quite critical at some point. Sadly, we are dealing with a non-linear system where somebody is pro and somebody is contra. But there is this issue. Besides some of the Republicans and Trump, there is a very uncertain position of the presidential administration. And I have to say that those Republicans who are trying to promote this law, to pass this law as the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Michael McCall, don't mix him with Michael McFaul. Michael McCall is congressman from Texas. Yesterday he was very tough on Jake Sullivan, the head of the National Security Council, and he blamed Sullivan for, if not sabotaging, but for not being interested in passing this important law. And the pressure from the administration is quite indirect. Besides, the Democrats in Congress, they're doing everything to bring this law to vote. And there's another thing, the big package that was passed in Senate with the overwhelming majority vote that includes the assistance to Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel. For this law to be put to vote, we need either decision of the Speaker, who can't quite decide what to do to save his post together with Democrats to get their support, or to try something within his own party. He's a weak person and he happened to be there incidentally, but his decision could be overrun if we have 218 votes. Right now Democrats have 213 votes. But maybe it's not such a big problem, but it seems that 24, 25 Democrats, progressive Democrats, they're against including assistance to Israel in that package. So and then it turns out you have to have not 5 Republicans, but 30 Republicans to overrun the decision. And thus we have this unending trouble. And at the same time, people are dying, there is a horrible war going on, and the American assistance, and not only assistance with weapons, it's also financial assistance, and also a psychological element. For many Ukrainians, this is an indicator that, put it bluntly, the West may just betray them. Eastern Europeans and Baltic countries, everybody is used to living in the world where America was the leader, and all of a sudden there is such an uncertainty. And of course, this uncertainty demoralizes those who are fighting on our side, on the side of Ukraine and on the side of the free world. And naturally, it gives more confidence to all these terrorists, dictators, bandits. And America seems to be hesitant to make a decision, and it doesn't have to do with the lack of weapons or money. It's not even a situation of 1938 or 1939, when it was clear that the West, at that point, the UK and France were not ready for the war with Germany, and the balance of powers was not obvious. Right now, it's just enough to make a political decision, and even without the decision of the Congress, America can give Ukraine a lot of weapons, and this is the decision of the president. And this decision would help Ukrainians on the battlefield, at least cluster shells that America can't use, and many other possibilities the president has without even waiting for the decision of the Congress. Clearly not of such a scale, but they have these capabilities, but they need a political will for that. Today we had a meeting in New York, and General Hodges spoke there, and he's a great supporter of Ukraine, and he does a lot for Ukraine. All these issues were raised, and I have a lot of contacts with retired American military, and they say the same thing, that this is an issue of political decision. The United States has resources, but the political decision will have consequences, because all these things are interconnected, and we spoke about it a lot. The assistance to Ukraine on the battlefield means, first of all, the escalation of the confrontation with Russia, and the current administration is scared to death of any threats that anything happens, and then immediately they will be swinging their nuclear bat. This is one risk, but in fact, subconsciously they have a different risk, that Ukraine wins, Putin falls, Russia falls apart, and a geopolitical chaos begins that they can't cope with. And I think this idea itself, the idea of the potential change of the regime, and as we know, according to Russian history, that happened regularly after each military loss, whether it's the First Crimea War or Russo-Japanese War or the Cold War. So this fear actually restrains Americans and the Europeans who don't understand the consequences of the Ukrainian victory, and they're trying to find some variant in between. But in the war, it can be like that. Any attempt to find a position in between plays for the aggressor. And for these 2 years, we can see the situation worsened. There can't be any potential improvements if we go in that direction. And besides, there is a quite serious risk that there is a great superiority of the Russian army in terms of ammunition, and it can be catastrophic on the front line. And many people in the West began thinking about some really decisive measures, even sending their own troops. And I think for the Poles, it's not taboo anymore. And also I'd like to note that Poland is saying that they need nuclear weapons too. Now we can see how the political and military thinking is going. So there is a risk that they may be alone, one-on-one with Putin, and it's not an issue of conventional war. So all these things, when they say in Russia, we can do this, we can do that, it's pretty obvious as of today that a combined power of the eastern part of NATO and even northeast part of NATO, Poland, Finland, Norway, and Sweden will be enough, together with Ukraine, to destroy Russians. There's a completely different balance. You immediately have air forces, Finnish artillery, and Polish army, which is huge. So there is this myth that Russian army can conquer Estonia. No, it's not going to happen. It is the continuation of the same myth that led the Russian army to the catastrophe in 2022. And this is a pure recalculation of the military resources without taking into account that Russia has nuclear weapons. That's why the American nuclear guarantee is a necessary condition. Maybe there will be a French nuclear guarantee. So, as I say, it's a very complicated process. I don't think that a catastrophe on the battlefield is probable, because the West understands the risk of it. But here in America, this political season, in my view, is absolutely disgraceful for America. This Biden versus Trump situation, of course, it undermines American reputation in the world and increases all the risks. You mentioned Jake Sullivan, and I just read one of his quotes today. And he said that if we're going to help Ukraine too much, Russia may launch a preventive nuclear strike against us. I don't know if the quote is right. Yes, the quote is right. It just shows you the level of strategic understanding of this, where this cowardice comes from. I'm telling you again, to comment on Sullivan's statements and the team that he brought together, there are different people who are rubbing shoulders with him. Some of them are professional fearmongers who always stood for this understanding Russia and making agreements with it, and some of them are just corrupted. The problem with Sullivan is that he never governed anything. He was always a staffer. He worked in somebody's team, always. For example, the Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, he didn't really govern much, but at least he had some top positions in the Department of State. But the governing position is a very special position, especially in the United States. At least Blinken understands his limitations, and he openly speaks about it. But Sullivan is confident that he is Kissinger #2, that he manages the fate of the world. And sadly, he influences international affairs, but the man, actually, everything he touched turned into trash. This is catastrophe in Afghanistan. This is a total misunderstanding what can happen in Ukraine. He ignored what could happen in the Middle East. On the date of Hamas's attack, his article came out and he said that the Middle East is completely living in peace. There's a total catastrophe in Venezuela. This is agreements with President Maduro, and as soon as the agreements were made, Maduro broke them and sanctions didn't work. So I would say this is the second-hand team of Obama. So Obama had this policy of retreat, and this is the people who do the same, but this is the people of the second tier, so to speak. I wrote a lot about Sullivan. It's good that they started talking about his role in all these events. So this is a tragedy of diminishment of American politics. And sadly, Biden himself, and we need to understand that he was always representative of a very cautious wing in the Democratic Party. During the Cold War, he was always a supporter of the theory that God forbid something bad happens. With aged Biden, Sullivan is the man whose office is next to Biden's, because Sullivan is in the White House, whereas Blinken or General Austin, who is in Pentagon, are not there. So Sullivan's influence and his team's influence on the American politics is unproportionally big, and sadly it matches Biden's general attitude, and clearly his life habits and his geopolitical assessment of the situation that is rooted in the Cold War. Over the years, all this has been progressing to the worst. So therefore, today, we see this constant indecisiveness. There is no any military expert in the United States who would seriously consider a nuclear strike against the United States. Yes, technical nuclear weapon might be, but strategic nuclear weapon, this variant simply doesn't exist in nature. One of the arguments they use says that using the strategic nuclear weapons after the years of the ban on testing it, it is such a thing that requires a lot of courage. And as we know, in the USSR, the percentage of failed tests was much bigger than in the West. That's why this many years moratorium that was imposed on the tests actually makes any Russian general think if they launch a missile where it's going to fly. So, and I think that it's just useless to discuss it in all seriousness. But this image of the threat and how easily it can be sold to an American layman, especially if this is machine of the White House that does it. That's why it creates this negative backdrop, and that's why Americans are pushing this disgraceful policy, because Ukraine is paying an incredible price for it, and everybody understands that, how absurd Sullivan's statements are. But the farther we go, the more we see that the American foreign policy is built on Medvedev's delirious statements. As we know, nature abhors the vacuum, and we can see that in the international politics. Europe is waking up, and within Europe there are new centers of power, and firstly it's France, of course. Unexpectedly for many, President Macron took this role of a leader of belligerent Europeans. So do you think he has a chance to resist Putin's pressure? The word chance is not quite right, because Europe can easily defeat Putin on its own, and I spoke already about the northern and eastern part of NATO, and if you add France there with its nuclear arsenal, so it changes the situation. Why Macron took on this initiative, it's clear, because France is in nuclear power, the UK too, but the UK is not part of Europe, but still it's part of NATO. France could play a decisive role in creating such a coalition. And of course, Macron being tempted to put on General de Gaulle's jacket, so to speak, kind of to try it on. So there is this desire, and traditionally France tried to play a role in Europe, and America was too big. If America is leaving Europe, then there is a vacant spot. Will Macron have enough juice to do that? I can't tell you. There are many arguments why it should be done, and they don't even need to send their troops there. All they need to send is several squadrons of French Mirage jet fighters with French pilots. The damage they can do will be critical for the Russian infrastructure. Clearly, using modern air forces will destroy the Kerch or Crimea bridge and will destroy all the logistics of the Russian army. The technological capabilities of the West of Russia are incomparable. And actually I have to say that Ukraine is fighting using old weapons of 1970s and 80s, and Ukraine doesn't have modern weapons. And Russia using these mythical Armata tanks and some jet fighters of the 25th generation. So if Russia provides that, then the West will bring what they have today in their arsenal. In the UK, in France, and actually in Finland, they get this modern F-35 from the States. And again, everything has to do with political will. Will Macron have enough of this will? It's hard to say. His political career doesn't let us say confidently yes. Can he do that? Of course he can. And I repeat, France has nuclear weapons, and he mentioned it. So therefore, we need to stop paying attention to these speculations. But there can be different issues, because political fights in France and incredible corruption, because Putin didn't waste time. 25 years of corrupting Europe. And we probably shouldn't forget what was happening during Yeltsin's time, because KGB was still there. So we have a situation when any decision of such a caliber requires big political will. So that's why, without even sending jet fighters to the front, and without even shipments of modern weapons to Ukraine, the West has such a reserve of resources to critically damage Putin's war machine. And then the question is, why don't they do that? In fact, it's not very difficult to block Russian oil way to the market. It is enough to introduce prohibitive tariffs on all oil coming through Danish Straits, on all the ships that don't have European registration. So in other words, the number of creative decisions that can be made to reduce Russian military potential and Russian economy. There are many of them. But again, we get back to this main issue. We need to admit that we are in the state of war. Putin is fighting with NATO, but NATO doesn't want to fight with Putin, and NATO is trying to do everything to avoid it. So this disbalance in this approach, it creates this political vacuum where they don't make decisions that could help finish the war. Yes, it's interesting that you mentioned economic instruments that they use to sanction Russia, and I have to say that sanctions work, no matter what people say, and particularly secondary sanctions that scare those who are involved in foreign trade. particularly in China and India, more and more banks and legal entities, they stop working with Russian enterprises. And this is a trend in Armenia and a number of other countries. They refuse to use mere credit cards of the Russian payment system, and it seems to be irreversible. And a Turkish export is reduced, an export of high-tech equipment, and I just read about it today, and it seems to be reversible too. The Turkish experts say that this process will be accelerating and will get to the point, as they say, there won't be any reputable company that will cooperate with the Russian Federation, and so on. As we can see, that secondary sanctions work, and we can also mention what's happening with Russian oil refineries, and it turned out it's very difficult to repair them after the drone strikes, because those refineries were repaired by Americans and Europeans, and there is an article on Reuters about that. But on the other hand, Gary, over the last few months, neither in Europe nor in the United States, I heard the word sanctions or a sanctions package. Are they planning to do anything? Is there any data, information, or rumors about new measures that can be introduced in the near future, or everything will remain the same? In fact, I don't want to argue about the sanctions, because they do work, but the process is going very slowly, and clearly the noose is being tightened, and the resource of the Russian economy, even under these sanctions, it's not unlimited. That's why Putin is trying to achieve some result in this year, new mobilization, and that's why they unleashed this hurricane of missiles, drones, and these new guided bombs of 3 tons that they thrown in Ukraine. Putin needs a big result, say taking over Kharkov, because we understand that Avdiivka doesn't quite match Stalingrad battle. So Putin needs a big victory, and they'll do everything to pressure Ukraine with the mass. Right now, Russian military production complex achieved its peak, and it can't go on like this for long, because extensive development of the economy by printing money and pumping economy with military expenses, this process is not endless. And also we need to understand that Ukraine's capabilities are not endless either. And because the drones, the missiles, and guided bombs destroy the economy, people, everything. In Russia, refineries are hit, but in Ukraine, the Russians destroy power plants. So, as I said, the potential of sanctions is not exhausted. But the main question is not the particular package of sanctions. The main question here is the confiscation of Russian sovereign assets. There are some disagreements about the amount, but it's not less than $250 billion. And in fact, it can be even more. How much more, we don't know. The only number that we know is $198 billion that they have in Belgium. So that's why here we're talking about a big amount of money. And here they keep fighting. And I have to say, the vector is shifting towards our direction, towards proper solution. There are several solutions that are offered today. Say the Brits are promoting the idea to use these assets as collateral, as a guarantee of new bonds that could be issued in favor of Ukraine. Given that Russia will have to pay for its war crimes and will have to pay reparations, so this money won't be confiscated now, but in fact, it will be used to help Ukraine and to restore Ukraine. Today, it's the main issue. An organization that I founded in the United States, Renew Democracy Initiative. Yesterday, we had a big event in New York. We were given awards to Heroes of Democracy. One of our awards was given to Kai Kallas, the Prime Minister of Estonia, as a person who is standing for democracy in the most critical situations. Estonia is directly bordering Russia, then Senator Fetterman, and then many others. And we had quite a representative panorama of heroes of democracy in the US and in the world. So our organization was an initiator of this process to raise money to publish the report that was prepared by the team headed by Larry Tribe, one of the leading American constitutionalists, the legend of Harvard University. He worked there for decades and he raised generations of American lawyers. And if you look at the list of his students, starting with Barack Obama, and in this report, they say that the President of the United States has real rights. It's 166 pages, real rights to use the capabilities that American law gives him in critical situations, and he can confiscate these funds. But there is no so much funds in the United States, Russian funds. It's about $10 billion, but the amount is still quite big. As they say, there is a positive shift. We can see that even those representatives of the American establishment, like heads of financial institutions in the US, they stopped categorically opposing this idea. They are considering different variants. They're trying to find a compromise with the Europeans. There are certain fears what's going to happen there, so what's going to happen to the assets that are still in Russia. But the main thing, the main question is, will this confiscation damage international financial system? As I see it, this fear is disappearing gradually. So that's why most probably the West will try to find a solution for the issue of confiscation of assets and giving those assets to Ukraine. And I think that may happen within the next 2-3 months, and G7 summit is coming soon too. And some solution will be found there, and it will be an important psychological indicator. They need to kind of cross a bridge, because we're in a total conflict, not even a war, and any measures are necessary. And I think 2-3 days ago, I think Stoltenberg, he made a statement that there will be a fund of NATO, $100 billion. Well, again, the rhetoric is right, and there is a feeling that they understand that the global confrontation with Russia is unavoidable, and you can't win the war without admitting the fact that it's not just a war to restore Ukrainian territorial integrity. This is a war where Putin's Russia must lose not just Ukrainian victory, it's also a defeat of Putin's regime and the failure of Russian empire as a concept. And I hope that new Russia that we will build together, this new Russia will get a chance to return to the family of civilized nations. Nonetheless, we are looking at the global state of affairs. As we called our today's show and meetings with you, there are issues in other parts of the world, and Iran is planning a strike against Israel. Houthis, they're continuing their pirate activities in the sea. How serious this is, and how it may impede this sort of general line to defeat Putin's regime. In fact, all this is interconnected, and all these issues, they stem from the Kremlin. Islamic terrorism was conceived in KGB vials. That's why Hamas is running to Moscow to get a piece of advice, and Taliban the same, and ISIS too. All of this kind of the same thing. All of this are kind of tangled together. All these organizations, they gave birth to this terrorism. I already mentioned Maduro in Venezuela and its potential crisis too, because there is a threat to invade the neighboring Guyana, and let alone Africa. It is a catastrophic situation there. The United States left it, and Russia and China now are conquering all this corridor from the Red Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. Several days ago, the government of Niger, they asked Americans to go away. I think it was the last military base in that region. This is the most important region where there are many mineral resources, especially chemical elements that are so important for mobile networks. And this now can be under control of Russia and China. And it's not because America doesn't have resources. America just can't find itself in some way. What is America today? When you mentioned Houthis, can we seriously think that with that level of American presence in the region, with American military base, they can deal with the issue of Houthis? There are Iranian bases there, so all this can be destroyed within a few hours. The audacity of Iran is because America has all this military power, but they don't use it. Houthis launched a rocket and Americans intercepted it. So what? Houthis are not a big power, so they put their rocket launchers in the desert and it's hard to find them there. But Iran is right there, and when Israel needs, they just destroy all those commanders, and they do it quite confidently. Besides, there are allies of the Americans. There are the Kurds who could help Americans, but Americans betrayed them many times, and the situation is quite catastrophic in the Gaza Strip. Israel does its best to reduce the number of casualties among civilians, whereas Hamas tries to PR as many victims as possible. The world seems to be understanding this, and yet they ask Israel to stop. Putin throws more bombs for 1 hour in Ukraine than Israel does in the Gaza. But people can't get their head around it because there is this propaganda channels working. And obviously Putin is a beneficiary of all this mess. And it must be understood. You can solve problem by problem, but you can make a radical step. You need to understand that the source of evil is in the Kremlin. So this is Putin's regime. That's why Ukraine's victory covers all those issues. Those issues will disappear. Because without this mafia boss of global banditism and terrorism, so not going to happen. So if Putin is gone with all his nuclear threats and with huge money too, that's why the issue must be resolved once and for all. And how we approach this matter, this is what's important. So just going from just a generalization of victory of Ukraine, they need to understand that they need to defeat Putin's Russia, and the most important component of this fight against Putin, this must be the Russian component. Those true Russians, those true citizens of Russia who do not recognize this bandit regime, and they think that the matrix of free Russia should be built in Europe, what we ironically call Russian Taiwan. Because the sanctions we spoke about, they hit not only oligarchs, but they hit our friends and many citizens of Russia who would like to leave Russia and not to be stained by Putin's regime, but they can't go anywhere. Because the Russian passport is like a prohibitive document that closed the roads everywhere in the civilized world. That's why we need a concept. I will be writing another article about it. More people begin to understand the idea of Russian Taiwan is very necessary. And finally, overrun Putin's narrative. The narrative that Putin's propaganda managed to impose on Russians. That this is the war of the West and Russia, but this is the war of the free world against Putin's Russia, and the free Russian citizens should be on the side of the free world. This is the decision that we made at the beginning of October at the Free Russia Forum meeting that we need to help people in the fight against Putin's Russia and help Russian battalions that fight on the side of Ukraine. As soon as they make a principled political decision that keeping Putin's regime is not a factor of geopolitical stability anymore, the situation will be changing very quickly. And I do my best, together with my friends and supporters and colleagues in the United States, to make this wagon move. Yes, I have to confirm, sadly though, that you are right. The policy of the West towards regular Russians who disagreed with the war and Putin's policy, I can see the consequences of the Western policy towards Russians. My friends who were well off, well educated, and Muscovites that used to support us in the meetings, in the rallies, now they're saying, so we're not pro-Putin, but the West doesn't want us either. So they said to us, can I go away? So, okay, fine. So we return to Russia, and in some strange way, they consolidate, if not around the throne, but they consolidate around the flag of Russia. And I see this negative trend, and I don't understand why in the West they don't understand. Those people don't understand the West who make the decision what's happening. Again, it's not a question of understanding. Everything today that in one way or another is considered as a potential change of the regime, and even our initiative of Russian Taiwan, whatever we call it, government in exile, for a Western bureaucrat who lives in this paradigm that, God forbid, for Putin's regime to fall, because horrible things will happen after that. So our initiatives like that are taboo in the Western world. That's why and we need to fight against that. And that's why issues of Ukraine and the defeat of Putin's Russia, all these issues are interconnected. And I think the main task of the Russian opposition is to try to kind of rise above all disagreements and to understand that we don't really have any way out. In Russia, nothing will happen until there will be a military defeat of Russia. That's why we need to unite and to form this matrix. And matrix is a proper word. Matrix of free Russia. Where we can do it, we should do it. And I think with this optimistic note, we will finish our today's show. And because it's quite optimistic what you said, and I hope we'll manage to do that. Thank you very much, Garry. So, and I hope you come to us more often. Thank you very much. Thank you. All the best. I remind you that today we had Garry Kasparov with us, the 13th World Chess Champion, the co-founder of Free Russia Forum. And as you see, dear friends, things are not as bad as they may seem. There is some hope, and there is a light at the end of this long, dark path. We will see what future has for us. I say goodbye to you. I am Daniil Konstantinov on the Free Russia Forum channel. Please push like button, and it helps to promote our channel.